Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the premier political, economic, and social analysis podcast of Uganda. Grab a coffee. For the first time, we're going to be analyzing what's happening in the news, the stories, and the people that make them. And to do that, I have with me the veteran, Mr. Simon Kasiache. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
It's surprising that now I am being referred to as a veteran.
Are you not a veteran?
I still feel very young at heart. I still see myself with so much life ahead of me.
Yes.
But it's very humbling, as the late Shaka Sadi would say. I'm exceedingly humbled and profoundly
honored
to be referred to as a veteran. May God rest his soul in eternal peace.
Yes. Simon Kasiache and I are going to be analyzing for you the top 3 stories within the region and trying to make sense of them. We're also going to try every end of the month to bring you a very rare access guest onto this podcast to give you some insight into politics, economics, and society in the region that we call East Africa. But Simon, on Wednesday, we woke up to torrential rains in Kampala. It's been shining for forever. People had been complaining about the sun. And then the Lord flicked the switch and gave us this very torrential, it was like a hailstorm, because I got up at 4:30 in the morning. I was going to read in the living room. And the wind that was just hitting the windows was just too heavy. And that rain went on throughout the whole day and the city turned into a mess. What were you doing on Wednesday?
Well, just like you, I think the rain came in when I was deep into slumberland. And when it rains, you know the whole atmosphere and everything. That's the best time of my existence in sleep. But then I also, like you, did pretty much wake up early to, not to grab a coffee, but grab the book that's normally by my bedside, just to catch up on what I was reading the previous night and then also check out the news. And so this went on with me, really unbothered of what's happening outside there. Although as it came down to daybreak, I began to worry. Intuitively, I know that when it rains like that, then Kampala begins to look messy. So for example, it's a Wednesday morning and from my little private business of a bakery, I have a client who I supply to bread first thing in the morning for their breakfast on Wednesday. I began to worry about my border guy that's supposed to be coming to pick the stuff. So I made a few phone calls and the guy told me, man, from where I am, I don't think it's going to be easy for me to access where you are. Now, let's not forget, I live somewhere on Buya Hill and this guy had to access my location. We're using a crossing that has the Chinawataka swamp. That's the swamp that should be draining the waters coming in from Chambogo Hill, Chereka Hill, Mbuya Hill, and then take it down to the lake via Bukasa, the peninsula there. And true to what he thought would be the best that it was, that place was cut out for several hours. So it was a traffic gridlock on that end. And interestingly, there were folks who were there, as usual, doing what they do best when it floods like that, standing by and just waiting to manually carry people who are daring enough to cross. Because there are those who life has to depend on mobility. But also even more interesting and more macabre, if you may, there are people picking up utensils because they are flying basins, saucepans, household equipment that has been washed out from, these shanty settlements that are on the banks of some of these swamps that break their backs. So I wasn't surprised with what then hit me in terms of images and videos then started being posted in the morning, throughout the day, people sharing their experiences. But then what was coming in and weaving through that bothered, and on the other part really made me a bit embarrassed, was the whole helplessness of the populace to say now, we on our own looks like.
I really wanted to ask you about this helplessness because I also was scrolling through my timeline and I could see people swimming, of course, through the floods, people's bikes getting lost, cars being overturned on their heads. I was listening to a radio report. I think they said 2 children had died because they'd stayed in a home where their mother wasn't.
Now the death toll as the reason to almost double digits. So
yes. But just give us a peek as an insider, because you've also worked at the KCCA. In terms of an emergency response, when you wake up as KCCA on the morning of a flood like that, what do you technically do? Is there an emergency meeting that you have? Is there a quick emergency response that you say, we will try and do these responses? I know KCCA has ambulances, for example. Do you deploy those? Just give us a peek into the workings at City Hall. What happens on a morning when something like that has happened?
A very interesting question coming to me at such a time when, Raymond, I must also start off with a disclaimer that yes, it's true, I have worked for the Kampala Capital City Authority and not in any other position short of being a member of the top management. I am still bound by certain confidentiality considerations, and therefore some of my initial knowledge of the workings of that place may not be the kind that I may want to share publicly for those considerations. But suffice it to say, you ask as a citizen who's been in this town for quite some time, if they were what you were calling emergency interventions, they wouldn't come in a cloud of invisibility or anonymity. If ambulances have been deployed in a place of emergency, you would see them, and KCCA has aptly and conspicuously branded ambulances, trucks, and all sorts of things. Question is, do you see them? So if you don't see them, I can't then claim that they have been deployed. Do we have an emergency meeting and all that? I mean, people are unable to access from their homes to town, and you are expecting that the emergency meeting is possibly going to sit? Perhaps not. And if it does, the emergency meeting, the conversations in there are, yeah, we didn't have enough resources to fix these drainages, this contractor is delaying, or, we need to collaborate with our friends in NEMA because you see there are some people who are degrading the wetlands here. We checked with the Ministry of Lands, and we discovered there were 63 freehold titles in the Chinawataka swamp, and that we've seen developers, the guys with the money, backfilling and constructing warehouses in that space. Then we've seen the poor folks on the other side of Banda, Cheka, into that valley, also coming closer and constricting the swamp. And we haven't done much in terms of evictions, in terms of restoration. So it comes back down to the helplessness I was talking about. Only this time, the helplessness within a body of people that should actually have the solutions, or at least have the plans for a solution.
That baffles me. I mean, I will not get into the administrative because you're still bound. You can't talk about administrative detail, but we can talk about the physical planning of the city. We really can get into that. You could clearly see one, for example, I did see the KCCA handle with the executive director saying that KCCA had taken to desilting areas where garbage had gone into. That was the technical side of KCCA. On the political side of KCCA, you had the Lord Mayor saying that all these rich barons who he mentioned, for example, Ham, that had built in such a way that offended the environment, and there was nowhere the water could go.
But now, that's when I wait back to ask the question. So, whichever side it is, you are telling the populace that someone came and built in a city that you have jurisdiction over. How did they get to build there? How do they complete their buildings that have such adverse effects? And now you're telling us after the fact, what are you doing about it? You see, I don't subscribe to the idea of people in positions of responsibility coming to tell us what we already know and possibly even feel deeper than they do feel. So what's new about what the political side of KCCA was telling us, that people are built in wetlands? We know that for a fact. We know them, but we don't have power over them as citizens to stop them, to curtail them. But you, as a city authority, you would rather be telling us that Ham came to build in a place that was not gazetted for building. We stopped him, or we attempted to stop him, and he overpowered us, maybe by use of barrels of guns, and we didn't have the same. And we are now in court, whatever miscellaneous, this and the other. So that you show us that there are steps you're taking. But when you join us in a pity party, then what are you doing at City Hall?
I hear you. But also, from a very technical side.
And that for me brings me the whole gist of this conversation. You see, Raymond will sit here and pontificate around this issue. But for me, even while I was at KCCA, it was very clear to me that not much traction is going to be done in as far as service delivery is concerned, if there are no consequences for someone not doing their job. And this cuts across board. That if I am a janitor supposed to ensure that Simon's desk is spick and span by the time he walks into the office at 7 a.m. and he finds the garbage littered all over the place and the papers scattered, that alone destabilizes someone's thought process and the ability to do their work, and there must be consequences to that person. Up to the point of the executive director superintending over a city where 8 millimeters of rainfall is going to create lakes and the kind of mayhem that we
A
did see.
catastrophe. But you mentioned the word consequences, and I don't know, my feeling, I might be wrong, but there's been some massive consequences on KCC EDs. Jennifer Musisi's contract not renewed. The replacement for Jennifer Musisi was Kitaka. He wasn't given the job. He was thrown out. Dorothy Chisaka, who came in, left on handcuffs straight into a case. And the new ED, Buzek, is just starting her job. So clearly, there seem to be some consequences. Is it that the consequences are not being visited on the right things, or is it that those consequences are not creating institutional change to respond to the needs of the city?
Let's put it this way. Without a fear of contradiction, I believe those consequences, as you want to call them, in my view, are a mere slap on the wrist. Because again, what is the consequence of those consequences? It is just, the fanfare, and you make it to the headlines of the newspapers, and that does not, to the greatest extent which I know, create some level of institutional gravitas to avert the next administrative consequence on the chief executive. So there is a certain layer of people, because at the end of the day, Mosisi was not the guy draining or desilting these channels. The current executive director is not the one who's desilting these places. There's a team of people, there are planners there. So when you have don't you see that is clear absence of a grand enforcement of what should be physical planning tenets? Make no mistake, I've had people make the argument that there is no physical planning to talk about as far as City Hall is concerned. I was there for close to 2 years, and what I know for a fact is that the shelves in there are filled up with plans, reports, and working documents. Where the rubber hits the road is on enforcement and or implementation. So
it's enforcement and implementation. But Simon, let's now take a bird's eye view away from the administration of the city. The city has...
Raymond, let's be very honest. And some will argue that we speak the way we do because we do not have the opportunity to be where we should be to make these changes. But frankly speaking, there ought to be a point where, as someone that holds even the smallest level of responsibility, you must take it upon yourself to ensure that some of these things happen and embarrass you. I went through that embarrassment quite a number of times. You drive around the city with your children and they can't imagine the state of the roads, and you leave home proudly every morning, say, I go to work at KCC. And they say, Dad, this is what you come to do. Maybe it explains why I take a painful personal decision to say, you know what, I just can't continue getting egg on my face if I'm unable to make any tangible contribution into ameliorating what I see as the dire circumstances the city finds itself.
The reason I wanted us to take a bird's eye view is that it's from a planning perspective. This city has grown from 1.5 million residents to now, I think, we're on the cusp of 5 million people. If the economy of Uganda remains structured around the city center, it's very likely that 10 years down the road we'll be 7 million, 8 million, or 10 million people. The amount of demand that's visited upon services in the city is just too much, whether it's from sewerage systems, water, planning, physical planning, housing and accommodation. So that bird's eye view is, who is thinking in this way to say, okay, this city is becoming unworkable, and if we do not do something dramatic, we may not be able to save it. If you had to think of dramatic ways to save the city, how do you start?
I'm in a similar situation of wonder. To imagine that the city that is, well, as old as independent Uganda, let's not forget that Kampala became the capital city of Uganda after the independence of Uganda, because Entebbe was the capital city. That the following areas are actually on the sewer line. Old Kampala, Nakasero, Kololo, Bogolobi. And that's just about it. The rest of everyone else, in those hills, much in the where they are on septic tanks. And that sewer line we're talking about is that was left by the colonial administrators of the city. That for 60 years, as a country, we've never found it worth to graduate from sinking septic tanks into going on a centralized sewer system. That for me baffles me. Is it that we lack exposure? Is it that we... But I have since gotten to understand that getting some of these jobs or positions of responsibility for most people becomes an end in itself. Again, why? Because there are no consequences for not performing.
Not performing, yes.
So people go in there to enjoy the grandeur that comes with being in these positions, have a lead car, have policemen opening doors for you, holding your handbag, calling you boss, going to meetings late because you have to make a grand entry because you are the boss. And that facade of big man, big womanship is what leads us to where you are. Again, on the backdrop of the fact that there are no consequences for non-delivery.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you are appointed by a blue letter, you know where that comes from. You know that you go, and it's in worst case scenarios where you have possibly had an altercation with certain centers of power over something as flimsy as sharing loot, that you end up being disgraced and fired. But other than that, you can work through and be the most incompetent but highly decorated administrator of anything, let alone the city. And that pervades down from the top office down. Because when they realize that there are no consequences, if you have no consequences in your own position, you can't, it becomes very difficult for you to put consequences below you and create effective change. But even those who try to do are increasingly becoming an endangered species. We've seen administrators or people who hold positions of responsibilities in different government agencies, let alone KCC, who try to enforce a work ethic and a culture that delivers results. They become a minority, and as such, they are either swallowed up by the whole grand amorphous system of incompetence, or they end up facing very dire personal consequences, not because of their competence, but because they did not toe the line of incompetence. For me, it is just one mess of a shamelessly incompetent society. There are some people who hold certain positions that if I were them as Simon Kasiate, I would not comfortably raise my head anywhere to show face and even introduce myself as so-and-so of this place.
Yes.
The same way, I for the longest time, to be very honest with you, whereas it was a job to do, and I loved it because I believed that as a head of communication, public affairs, and stakeholder management, that KCCA provided me an incredible platform to hone my skills in that regard, because there is a crisis to communicate about every single day. In fact, a crisis upon a crisis.
Yeah, because in your time you had the garbage crisis, you had the roads crisis.
There was a crisis
Spire
every
visited
day.
upon you the portal crisis.
Absolutely, I was exhibitee number one. Then you have a plethora of stakeholders every single day with very well-grounded demands and the need for information. You have partnerships to grow because you are the center, you are the heartbeat of the country's economy. So for me, in my docket, it was very attractive. But you are operating in a space that is bigger than just your docket, and for the most part, does not give you the impetus to do your work extremely well, to the extent that when you show up at a local club with your friends where you normally sit and have conversations with peers, you walk in there in shame. Because everyone say, no, you're here, but what kind of roads?
What kind of roads are you dealing with? But someone, very finally on this topic, it baffled me, and I was spending some time listening to an interview of Jakaya Kikwete. And then I realized the core members of the EACU, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, we're probably the only ones that still have one city. Tanzania they moved and created Dodoma as a secondary city. Kenya has created Mombasa, but also they've devolved their government in a way that allows for people to stay in their villages and work from their villages. Why are we the only ones that have stuck to this idea that only Kampala is the gateway to success? Kampala has all the government offices. Kampala has all the business, generates 75% of the revenue. And are we not able to look beyond that and say, okay, maybe go to Nakasongola or something?
I may sound a bit callous in this regard, but I've thought about this over time, and I hinge it on my own personal history and upbringing. See, Raymond, I am close to 50 years, but I was glad to have been born in Kampala and raised here. But I've seen my cousins who came from the village, my uncles who came from the village. To them, their picture of success was leaving whatever hellholes they were coming from in those remote areas we call our villages to come into Kampala. Today, those folks that came in piggy riding and going to secondary schools here or university for the first time in Kampala are the folks that are in these big positions that should be making that decision. Now, the guy is already in Mecca, so to speak, and I'm using Mecca as a figure of speech because we're still in the holy month of Ramadan or just coming from it.
Yes.
That's not the kind of person who's going to think that another city should be created in Nakasongola. To them, psychologically and physically, you're taking them out of Kampala. For them, when they arrived in Kampala, they arrived at the Holy Grail. Now, the bulk of these decision makers that should be thinking of devolution and all sorts of things, to them, when they arrived in Kampala, it's like how everyone clamors to go to a city like London. Now you're telling them, no, you can actually make a proper living in Manchester. They would go grudgingly. Only to realize, of course, Manchester has been made.
Yes.
So until a certain point, maybe we're hoping that the generation after them, these villagers, because they came in here, they are in Kampala is an end in itself, they are raising their children in this, what they have now turned into a pigsty. Maybe the generation of their children will begin to say, come on, we just cannot live in this state that our parents have subjected ourselves into. We have a vast country. I mean, it beats my understanding. Most cities I know in developed places are water facing. Kampala is located really by the shores of Lake Victoria, but it is facing away from Lake Victoria and grows away from the lake. Nakasongola would be a tremendous place by the River Nile. I mean, cities like Cairo, Khartoum, and have developed on the banks of the Nile, overlooking the Nile. But that had to take a certain social consciousness of the people in there to change their mindset. I am hoping that the generation to come, it will have to take a lot of work.
You reminded me of a friend of mine, Egyptian friend Hamad. We were discussing the River Nile. He took for me a picture of himself at the end of the River Nile in Cairo. And I sent him a picture at the source of the Nile. And I told him, this is like light and day.
Absolutely.
But we've got to take a very short break. When we get back, we switch gears and talk about the electricity crisis in the country. Welcome back to Grab a Coffee, and in this second part of Grab a Coffee, we switch gears into the second biggest story making headwaves in Uganda, and that is the fact that the government of Uganda has ended its concession with UMEME, and that concession is going to be inherited by UEDCL Limited, which is also a government company. Now, there are many jitters, there are many angles to this story, but the first one that we'll start with, Simon, is, was this a wise decision?
Well, I wouldn't want to go on the scale of whether it was wise or not, but what I can say without a doubt is that this was a long time coming. When UMEME took on the concession from Uganda Electricity Distribution Company Limited in 2004 for 20 years, it was clear that this is going to be a concession that's going to have a lifetime, and that there were conditions in the concession agreement of investment, of development, and of service delivery in as far as electricity distribution is concerned. And then, of course, along the way, there would be assessments, there would be appraisal on whether or not UMEME merits to have this concession extended by government of Uganda. Let's not forget where this all started from. It all started from Uganda's electricity from generation to distribution, and to a large extent, its regulation was under the ambit of Uganda Electricity Board. And this was split up to increase efficiencies in the three major sectors, which is generation, transmission, and distribution.
Explain to an ordinary person what that means. Generation is getting
predominantly at the time when this decision was made, Uganda had one source of electricity, which was hydro power. And this was being done at the government of Uganda owned facility, what we now know as Narubari Hydropower Station, or the Owen Falls Dam, which is the first hydropower station on the River Nile, interestingly, commissioned in 1954 by no other than the late Queen of England, Elizabeth II. And then, of course, later there was an extension project to the Narubari hydropower plant, which had an initial generation capacity of 180 megawatts. So an extension was made in the early 90s to create what now we know as Kira hydropower station with an installed capacity of 200 megawatts. So at that time of the concession conversations, we had 380 megawatts of installed capacity. But at the time, Uganda had just come in from, the debilitation of war and general rundown of different sectors, later on the electricity sector. So even after breaking down UEB to increase efficiencies in generation, which now would go into transmission, which are the high power voltage lines that you see moving power from hydropower stations to substations, which are normally in the sizes of 33 kVA. That's not very technical terms, but the big pylons that you see. And then the distribution is what you get from the substation, like the one you see in Lugogo, into now your domestic use or industrial use. Now, Uganda did not have, one, the financial capacity to rehabilitate the hydropower stations and the infrastructure therein. But also our distribution network had broken down for the most part, but also the country had grown to such an extent that the network needed to be expanded. And neither did we have the financial muscle to repair what had broken down or expand the network to where it should reach. And the expansion is certainly never ending, because every single day there's a nook and cranny of this country that requires a power line to get to it. So a decision was taken. Wise decision, say, let's bring in folks with some capital. They invest. We allow them time to recoup their investment through the depreciation of some of their historic assets, and also pick up their revenue from the tariff. Hence, the coming on board of Eskom, a South African subsidiary that came in here as Eskom Uganda Limited, and then UMEME, that's for the generation part, and the distribution part.
This is a difficult conversation because, one, you are a former Eskom staff member. Two, you are a member of
I was hired at Eskom to ensure that the Eskom concession is renewed.
Yes.
And then UEGCL, we should have renewed Eskom's contract, hired me to be part of the movement to ensure that Eskom's concession is terminated on its D-Day. And I am glad that...
Yes, but the reason why I asked you whether this is a wise decision or not is, increasingly, government has gotten around the bend and decided to centralize itself. It had previously let some of these things go to the private sector. It's now centralized. It started in generation. All the generation assets have been inherited by government and being run. That I could see
effectively.
That I could see was easy because the client was one. You didn't have to supply the generation equipment to many people. You just supply to the transmission line. The transmission lines have only one client, who is UEDCL. But in UEDCL, why I worry, I don't contest the decision. Why I worry is that on the other end of the bend, you have almost 3 million Ugandans who are consuming this power in the city center, for example. You have an expanded network, which might come to almost 11 million households who are getting this power. Now, my biggest question around this is efficiency. Because unlike other areas, power is required here and now. Every day it is demanded and consumed.
Let me explain it to you in the simple terms in which I used to explain why there won't be major disruption when UEGCL takes over Eskom. There was the very basic line of saying, look, Ugandans are going to lose jobs because UEGCL is taking over. And I said, no. What you lose as a staff member of Eskom is that badge on your chest that reads Eskom. So that badge will be taken away and will be replaced
with UEGCL.
For the most part, many of those folks in there, I know for sure 2 people that lost their jobs at Eskom. The managing director, Toza Maganji, and the technical director. Both were South African. They went back to their respective countries. Why, again, there couldn't have been 2 MDs? There was already an MD at UEGCL, Dr. Harrison Mutikanga.
Yes.
Come UMEME. UEDCL is taking over UMEME. They are not taking over a name UMEME. They are taking over the installed technical capacity that you're talking about. The transformers, the lines, the whatever. They are also, for the most part, also going to consume the same human resource, because at the end of the day, UEDCL, even if, and it should, requires to beef up its human resource to now ensure that they are able to run this operation. The best place they would be looking for is within UMEME. And who is in UMEME that's working and making the magic or the absence of it? Fellow Ugandans. So the Ugandans in UMEME know that they're just going to have their badges switched from UMEME to UEDCL.
Yes.
Will there be some folks that will lose their jobs? Of course.
Well, let's assure, because the Minister for Energy did respond to a tweet of mine in which he said at least 191 people will be made redundant. But that's not in contest. I think that
But
probably
what would be redundant is the technical capacity that you're worried of, that
Yes.
UEDCL is going to be able to run business as UMEME has been doing.
Yes.
And if it does, it goes back to my earlier conversation, then there should be consequences for that lapse. And that lies squarely on the managing director of UEDCL as we know him today. Or at least government should ensure that they have a guy up there that is up to the task of ensuring that there is proper running. And this whole idea of incompetence being hidden behind, oh, we don't have money for operations, our capex budget is low. Look, any manager hiding behind the absence of resources should be able to succinctly show what they have been able, the little they have been able to do
with the resources at their disposal. Yes, Simon, this is also the other aspect of this conversation is that it's not a smooth baton handover. It's not like UMEME has decided they'll hand over the baton that easy.
No, certainly
We've
not.
seen a letter,
and
the letter has come very specifically from their lawyers, not from UMEME themselves. They are contesting the valuation that they are supposed to be paid out. Now, on 1st April, one of two things
happened.
One of two things, which is payment. We have 30 days from the handover within which to make
These are the facts.
A full payment.
These are the facts on the ground, Raymond. According to the concession from the argument of UMEME, is that at the end of their concession, UMEME will be able to determine what value they should be brought out in terms of their undepreciated assets.
Yes.
And of course, their unrecovered investment from the tariff. Now, according to UMEME, they had put this into hundreds of billions, maybe up to about 700 and something billion. Government of Uganda, using the Electricity Regulatory Authority, did make an assessment and said, no, from where we sit as the regulator, because we're the ones who give licensing to UMEME and we know what, and we're the ones who approve their investment, their capex and all sorts of things, their budgets, we know that they are in the range of about, 500 billion. Okay, that is still less than what UMEME was
expecting. Yes.
Then, Auditor General comes into the picture because government says, no, we need the Auditor General to delve deeper and present to us the actual picture of what is wholly and duly owed to UMEME. And what does the Auditor General come up with? A report that says, these guys max 430 billion, which is slightly above half what UMEME was expecting. Now, government of Uganda has dug in deep and said, look, we will pay you what our Auditor General has said is wholly and duly owed to you. UMEME, on the other hand, has said, look, we are shocked by this evaluation of the Auditor General. We are going to pass this news on to our shareholders, and then we will be guided on what next steps to take, if at all. From my reading of the circumstances, certainly, because according to UMEME, any value that is about more than 25 billion Ugandan shillings in value has to go to international arbitration. So we're going to see possibly a case in the London Court of Arbitration and all that. And of course, we know the gymnastics around there. But for me, I'm glad that a step is being taken by way of doing what ought to be done. My only contestation comes to the timing. I mean, this has been a 20-year concession.
Yes.
The decision not to renew UMEME's contract was arrived at least by presidential directive over 2 years ago.
Yes.
Why are we seeing a lot of running taking place, even seeking loans from a commercial bank taking place in the last fortnight? To an extent that Parliament sat and even approved the Auditor General's report, which is in favor of Uganda, by the way, because it reduces the money that would otherwise have paid. Because the Auditor General's report, in fact, has a figure less than what the Ministry of Energy
was willing to
pay, and even had gotten a loan for.
Yes.
From
the
commercial bank. Absolutely. But the members of Parliament did not even have, the report was handed over to the Speaker at 9:30 in the morning, and at 10:30 there was a plenary sitting, and that plenary sitting should have passed this. So the quickness with which the process is being done, for those of us who are sticklers to detail, to merit, to ensuring that you leave no room for speculation or argument by detractors of an otherwise noble cause, this could have been done very well and in time to allow for conversations. The kicker, as I conclude, Raymond, is I've been around these corridors for some time to recognize, and with a lot of cynicism, that some of what you see is a roughshod running over issues is not so much for the greater good for which it is portrayed to deliver, but there is always some pecuniary interest that is against the greater public good. And I'm just hoping that this is not the case with this transition.
I'll give you just my analysis and this is as a political reporter who's really made their name through cutting names and making enemies in this city. Hand on heart, I think the Auditor General's office is one of the best public institutions Uganda has.
I am surprised by their levels of efficiency when they choose to do it. Because I read, for example, a recent report they issued on this payment of 60 billion that was just disappeared from Bank of Uganda Ministry of Finance. I was shocked at the level of depth and their analysis of especially fine detailed computer gymnastics in there and their ability to get into servers, some that may not even have been known to the perpetuators. Come out.
Much credit to Mr. John Mwanga, who's since left the place. He left fantastic institutions there. And I trust them hand on heart. They're one of the best public institutions. But I know that our government is a large bulwark of multiple institutions, competing interests. And in this particular UMEME matter, you have the Ministry of Energy, you have ERA, you have UEDCL, you have the Parliament of Uganda, you have the Auditor General, the Office of the President, CMI, and ISO.
You haven't spoken about the police, have you?
No, the police hasn't yet checked in. But when you have this bulwark of interests, all including also the Attorney General, if you have all these offices all scrutinizing one transaction, all trying to meet their interests and ends in one transaction, you're very likely going to have a snag.
And yet for me, I would want to believe that despite all those so many interests you've talked about, the overriding interest should be two things. One, stable supply of electricity to both domestic use and industrial use without hitch. Number two, an affordable tariff. The moment those two, as in, let them do whatever they want to do down here, kill themselves, bathe in blood and all that. But at the end of the day, as an ordinary citizen, I want to be able to have a stable and reliable supply of
electricity in your home.
Which, by the way, has since moved out from being a mere utility. It should actually be at the level of a human right. Because nothing now happens without electricity that will make any comfortable living. And then it's affordability. And affordability, I'm not saying give us obnoxiously, we now understand, it costs money to generate, transmit, and distribute. But can it be affordable? Especially considering that we run some of, a high tariff compared to our neighbors in the region. Where our aspiration is to have an East African power pool. And yet, for the most part, we have a higher installed generation capacity to the extent that there is the argument that we, in fact, export our unutilized electricity to our neighbors. Why? Because we have a higher generation capacity than the actual consumption.
But Simon, that's not just down to generation and transmission and electricity. I think most of the reasons why we have a high tariff is really down to financing. We don't own the money that is invested in our bulwark of infrastructure in electricity. I equally think, and I'm worrisome with UEDCL because tomorrow, if you inherit these assets, for example, and the transformer blows up, you have to undergo a public procurement and disposal of assets through the government structure to be able to get a new transformer. That can be a very painfully slow process, This is where private sector would have succeeded, where government may not succeed. And it's not that we don't trust UEDCL, it's just that the structure and bureaucracy and efficiency of the government is now going to come to the test and on a daily basis.
What I have learned, Raymond, and in my interaction with PPDA, for example, and I've had conversations, including with this good man, Benson, the head of PPDA. PPDA is not actually meant to slow down and reduce efficiencies in procurement or the disposal of assets. It is supposed to plug the gaps that government would get hemorrhage of its resources. But what happens in these cases that government officials have learned, like Chinua Achebe wrote in his book famously, and I love quoting this, that the more the hunter learned how to shoot without missing, the more the birds learned how to fly without patching. That the more, measures and constraints you put in hemorrhage of public resources, the more government officials have learned to circumvent that and hide behind that to create some invisible inefficiency so that you disabuse the system. And that's why, for the most part, procurements that should otherwise, because you know that these generators, transformers, wires have a lifespan. Raymond, even in the private sector, when you procure this cap and it says best before 5 years from today. You must kick in the procurement of its replacement if you know you are slow, 3 years ahead of time. But what we do is we wait until the last month.
The last day, yes.
So that we create an emergency.
Yeah.
And at that point, we put aside all the necessary procurement checks and balances so that we can go roughshod into the procurement. Hence, the corruption that you see. So make no mistake to imagine that the PPDA or government procuring systems are actually out to stifle efficiency. No, it is us who have now learned how to circumvent them by creating emergencies where they shouldn't be and by hyping up the so-called inefficiency, if for nothing else, to create an emergency at the end for us to pick up.
That's really great. We will
and that's
have...
why I'm saying there should be consequences. I mean, if you are someone charged with the responsibility of the replacement of a bulk of transformers, I mean, which electricity distribution company, if you have 100 transformers already deployed, the least you should have is 95 similar transformers in store, waiting to replace any of these, either at the end of their lifespan or in case of an emergency like a blow up or anything. But you say that you start the procurement of a transformer upon the explosion of the current transformer. That for me is not serious plan.
Fantastic. We're going to have this conversation. It's going to be a running conversation.
Absolutely.
Because every Friday we'll be back here, and one of the things I'm sure we'll be talking about is this power thing.
What for me is intriguing is how UMEME is digging in on one end and government is digging in on the other end to such an extent that now we are seeing the Minister of Energy
openly tweeting and asking UMEME,
exchanging what should otherwise be hard-nosed dictums to UMEME. And it's now playing out on in the court of public opinion.
Yes, we love to see that. We love to see open government. We love to see an open government. But Simon, as we conclude this, I know we'll be back next Friday, but we purpose to spend the last few minutes of this show talking about the great man, Mr. Shaka Sali, who was a veteran broadcaster, correspondent at VOA, the host of Straight Talk Africa, and for many people, he's the aspirational journalist that they wanted to become.
Shaka Sali dead at 71. The voice of Africa's untold story.
Africa.
And for that, I would say, get better, not bitter, Africa. And please, please, let's keep the African hope alive.
How do you remember Mr. Shaka Sali?
In around 2005, I sat at a very privileged position where Daily Monitor at the time chose me to be the journalist that would cover the return of Dr. Kizza Besigye from his exile that had now been close to 5 years. And so I recall correctly coming on the same plane with Dr. Kizza Besigye and having very rare but exclusive access to him. And his dear wife Winnie was coming in from Addis with Ansam, and Dr. Besigye coming in from South Africa with another set of his children. And subsequent to that arrival, then Besigye starts moving around the country a few months later, and then he's arrested around Busega. You remember that famous arrest of Besigye? And that now began the whole staccato of events around him being in and out of court, the double jeopardy of him being charged with the same crimes in civilian courts and the same time, same crimes
in the
court martial. Yes. That's when I heard for the first time a word like double jeopardy. And so when I am going through the gymnastics of understanding, all those circumstances at the same time, because now they had now become more like a reliable senior reporter of the Daily Monitor. And then one day I recall a swarm of stick-wielding men storm out of Central Police Station, beating everything and anything that they met in his wake, the Chiboko Squad. So while I was in my hiding, shielding myself from the Chiboko Squad, I received a phone call from the +1. And I said, who is this one calling me from the US at 3 p.m. And on the other hand was a baritone voice in the deep Chichiga accent. This is Shaka Sali. Is this Ndugu Kasiate? I said, what do I owe a phone call from a colossus like Shaka Sali?
Yes.
Of course, I had watched him and all that, but I didn't think that I would merit him calling me. And that began my relationship of interacting with Shaka Sali, because he needed to understand from the underbelly of what was happening, to understand the But so he came off as a nosy reporter trying to understand the underbelly. Eventually our friendship grew because he asked me about my parentage. I talked to him. We became friends. And I began now, at some point, months later, I began to start dreading his phone calls because Shaka Sali would be on the line for an hour. And just talking and mentoring and all that. I found him a very interesting guy. And when we eventually got to meet physically, there were no need for introductions because we both knew how each of us looked like. I remember that frustrated look on Shaka Sali's face when I met him on the veranda of the International Conference Center, when I think it was clear that he was not going to moderate the presidential debate for reasons that those who stopped him know better than I did. And he put me on the side and said, "My son Kasiate." And he spoke in Ruchiga. What a shame to be Ashoba. Things have really gone south. So he was extremely vexed that time, and but he had a certain graciousness around him, but you could see he was really, I'd never seen him in that state of affairs. But long story short, really, I think seeing the eulogies that are coming in and what people in our trade are saying about him, I can't claim to have had a special position in his heart. He seems to have, every one of us that was in the trade of journalism seemed to have a special place in his heart. And I think he treated us all with dignity, with strength. And so I failed to crack him in terms of at a personal level and all that. But what I found intriguing is that he had spent all these many years in the US and broadcasting for the national broadcaster, and his accent had remained deeply rustic, as opposed to some of you.
That is the seven mysteries of the world.
On your way to Oxford, your accent changed. And I said, "Now, Raymond, please, you haven't even arrived in Oxford." But I found him a very interesting guy, and even in his retirement, he remained gracious. I challenged him to one thing that he didn't live up to. I don't know why I always challenge my friends who live in the diaspora to say, "You are complaining so much about what's happening here. How about you come and be part of the movement to lead changing here?" And his answer was neither here nor there, but I can understand. Sometimes you find yourself in a hopeless situation that you are unable to make any significant change, even if you roll yourself in the mud in this place. So his legacy is an indelible one, especially those of us who are lucky to practice journalism at the time he was practicing. And we hope that maybe, as a personal wish, that I hope that maybe when some of us pass on, we are able to have this kind of overpouring of kind eulogies with people who say they attribute their success professionally to the mentorship that you had on them, whether physically, directly, or indirectly. He goes at a time when I regret the fact that I was unable to hold him down to share with me his incredible life story. And so it's one of those big losses I feel that for my incredible life stories, Shaka Sali is not one of those. And so that's also a message to many of those who are living incredible lives, that when I knock on your door for an incredible life story, please be generous enough to share it, because that would be your own
legacy. Yes.
It would be an auto obituary, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. I probably met Shaka Sali before I came to my senses. The VOA had a partnership with the Voice of Toro, which my mother was a part of. And this one evening, a gentleman is in our living room
in Fort Worth,
sipping wine, taking beer, and it looked like it was a very, very happy environment. He was there with a man called Mboijana, Richard Baguma is of this world, Cash Kasimbazi. And I didn't know who he was. He clearly had held fort. The entire room was listening to him.
He was at the center of it.
I was more interested in the Walkman radio I was holding and what was coming out of it. But much later in my journalism life, this is when I was at NBS, the arrest, when Bobi Wine was arrested, I received a direct phone call from him like you on a +1. And we had this very long conversation.
He had a way of calling after arrest. So
but a very long conversation in which he asked that he be linked to Bobi Wine, and then eventually they could have an interview with each other. And eventually that interview happened, and we remained in constant communication. I reminded him of that moment where I sent him a picture. Actually, I was like, "This is the picture that emerged from the day you came home." It's like, I can't remember that day, but I'm thankful to God that our paths crossed at a very young age and that you've become a journalist. Like you, I am unhappy with him because I think I'd asked him also I sent him Jeff Koinange's book, and I thought, for the time he'd lived, he should have written at least 2-3 books to his name. I don't think that has happened. But as much as possible, try and remember his legacy moving forward. Ladies and gentlemen,
at least we remain exceedingly humbled
and profoundly honored
to have known him.
Let us remain better, not bitter. Thank you so much for listening to Grab a Coffee. We'll be coming to you every Friday, discussing for you political, social, and economic events that have happened within the region. Have yourselves a great day.